Hello, my name's Mike Page. I'm the head of the Centre for Research in Psychology and Sports Sciences, and under normal circumstances I would be talking to you in person about the research that we conduct in the psychology section of the Department of Psychology and Sports Sciences. And unfortunately though, I'm currently at home, as are most of you, under isolation due to the pandemic. I'm hoping that when you're listening to this that you are safe and well and your loved ones are safe and well, as we are here. I'm speaking to you from North London. So I'm sorry that we can't be together for the open day at which I was due to address you, but what I've done is I've recorded some of what I would have said on that day to accompany these slides, and I hope that you find the commentary a little bit useful. What I normally would have done at this stage was to tell you that everything that I'm going to tell you in this presentation is currently true, but that circumstances change all the time, particularly with research. It's one of the things we're proud about, that the research adapts. And indeed, things are changing faster than we probably thought they would through all this, all the circumstances in which we find ourselves. But nonetheless, everything I'll tell you is currently true, and but might have changed by the time that you join us. So I would normally give this disclaimer, which you can read for yourselves on this slide. It just says terms and conditions may apply, etc., etc., that sort of thing. Just to say that things will change over the years, but this, what I'm about to tell you, is currently true of our department. I'd like first to spend a few slides introducing my own research. In fact, when you come to Hertfordshire to study a psychology degree, you'll end up, I hope, with one more psychology degree than I have. My original work, my original degree, was in engineering science at Oxford University, and after that I did a PhD at the University of Wales, Cardiff University as it is now, and that PhD was somewhat in the area of artificial intelligence. The title of the PhD was Modelling Aspects of Music Perception with Self-Organizing Neural Networks. It's quite a mouthful, I agree. But that was really about using neural networks, which are a form, you might know that, some of you, as what's currently called deep learning, or in its latest and most fashionable version, it's called deep learning. But my PhD was about doing neural network models of music perception, which of course is halfway between engineering, the modeling, and the psychology of human behavior in relation to music. And it was only after that that I really went full-time into psychology. That was a bit of a staging post, and I ended up, almost by chance, working with Alan Baddeley, which some of you will have heard of. Alan Baddeley, one of the foremost theorists of short-term and memory in general, in fact, that Britain has ever produced. And I, not coming from a psychology background, accidentally ended up working with Alan Baddeley. Some of you might have encountered the Baddeley and Hitch working memory model of 1974, for which they are most famous. Of course, having a psychology A-level is not a prerequisite of coming to study psychology, but some of you might have heard of Alan. And I worked with Alan for 7 years at the Medical Research Council Applied Psychology Unit at Cambridge. It subsequently became the Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit. And that was as a consequence of my having studied the perception and cognition relating to music, because Alan was interested in sequences, memory for sequences. Part of Alan and Graham's working memory model was the phonological loop, which was specialized for remembering sequences. And so I worked with them on neural network modeling of the phonological loop. And that had launched, this was in the early to mid 90s, and that launched an academic career for me in psychology, studying very closely the links between sequences, being able to recall sequences. So like if I ask you to remember the list R, H, Y, X, Q, Z, that's about the limit at which people start, after which people start making mistakes. And studying things like the phonological similarity effect. So if I give you a list like P, V, G, T, D, C, that's actually more difficult because the items rhyme. So we were studying things like that, and for the time between now and then, some 27 years, I've been studying sequence recall. I've also been studying the links between sequence recall and word learning. It turns out that there are some patients who've had a stroke or whatever, and they are unable to repeat back lists of even 2 or 3 items in length. And those patients, without fail, also find it very difficult to learn new words. So we believe that the sequence information that is present in those lists is similar to the sequence information, or it shares some mechanism with the sequence information that is used in learning the sequences of sounds that make up a new word. And that links through to how we perceive sequences of sound that we do know, so how you're perceiving the speech that I'm currently making. So these have all been the studies of my research for the last 20-something years. In doing that, as I said, I've been doing neural network modeling. That's a species of computer simulation, making simulations on computers that relate somewhat to the way we believe the brain is structured and how it works. So we simulate networks of neurons. I won't go into that in too much detail, but the specific version of that I do is called localist neural network modeling. So I've done quite a lot of work on that. And we've also studied over the years neuropsychological methods. So when we study people, as I just referred to, who have had some what we call a brain insult, or such as a stroke or some closed head injury or something like that, and they've lost a particular function, what does that tell us about the way the system functions in the absence of damage? That's very interesting. I've also studied and criticized in some cases functional magnetic resonance imaging, brain scanning methods as applied to psychology. And the last one of my interests, which I'll talk a bit about because it affords rather nicer pictures, if I'm honest, is pro-environmental behavior change. As an engineer and as someone who politically, with a small p, is aligned with the environmental movement, I found it interesting to try and apply both my engineering knowledge and my psychological knowledge to issues of how we might change our behavior in order to be pro-environmental, more environmentally friendly. I think that's a very interesting question, and I'll say a little bit about that in what follows. The pressing issue for many people who will be joining as undergraduates and who are not mature students, climate change will be one of the defining issues of your lives, in fact. And you might think to yourself, well, what has psychology got to do with that? Surely that's a physics problem, or it's an engineering problem. But I think psychology is very important. Climate change is really not just a technological problem. It's also a very profound behavioral problem. Cognitive psychology, which is the type of psychology that I do, the psychology of how people process information, how they think, in inverted commas, and social cognitive psychology, which is how people think and behave when they're in social situations, has got a very great deal, I think, to tell us and to help us in relation to addressing problems of climate change. One thing we know, for instance, from the history of that sort of psychology, social cognitive psychology in particular, is that changing attitudes doesn't always necessarily change behavior. Some of you will know that. Some of you might have got all your attitudes absolutely in order. You might have a very good attitude about how much revision you're going to do or were going to do, or whether you're going to stop smoking, or whether you're going to do more exercise, or whether you're going to help more, eat more healthily rather. But we know that having those attitudes is not enough. You also have to change behavior, and changing behavior is very much more difficult than changing attitudes, it turns out, and there's quite a lot of psychology about that, and it's very relevant, of course, to the psychology of mitigating climate change. And we did a lot of work on this, not a lot, but I've done different types of work on this. One with my colleague Nadine Page, no relation, we just happen to share a surname. And in that work, we identified what we called the hot topics of pro-environmental behavior change. And those were habits, opportunities, and thoughts. You don't work in serial order for sequences for 25 years without trying to come up with a decent acronym at least. I often talk about these in a different order. Opportunities, thoughts, and habits, but off topics is a very bad acronym. So I'll just give some examples. Now it says here, as Professor Wiseman showed you. Now normally I am preceded in these talks by talk by my colleague Richard Wiseman, and he would precede this talk with a demonstration of various psychological phenomena, including a phenomenon by which people don't see things to which they're not paying attention. This is sometimes called inattentional blindness. Now, you might not have seen the talk by Richard under these circumstances, but believe me, there is a thing called inattentional blindness, and there is a sense in which you simply don't see, you certainly don't perceive things to which you're not paying attention. And we extended this thought to issues relating to the environment. There is a sense in which, because people are not paying attention to their carbon emissions, for instance, that they really don't see them, they don't perceive them, they don't notice them. And so one of the jobs that we need to do as psychologists is to bring to people's attention the opportunities that they have for cutting their carbon emissions. And that's one of the things that we needed to do. Now, this all sounds like a truism. It sounds obviously true. But it turns out that it is not sufficient to bring things to people's attention. You do also have to get them to act on them. I sometimes illustrate this with a little video on which you'll see on the next slide, which Richard made with a fellow called Dennis. And he'd been filming with this fellow called Dennis all week, talking about what Richard called his lucky lab. And Richard had been telling him how people who were lucky tended to notice things around them which they were able to use in their favor. They were alert to opportunities around them. I'll just run up this video because I think it's illustrative of how simply telling people that opportunities exist is not always enough.
Finally, in our last day at Dr. Wiseman's Lucky Lab, yours truly got a lesson in navigating with eyes wide open.
There'll be a huge opportunity come staring them right in the face, and they simply don't see it. This is just fascinating to see what's happening there.
And after you get the gag, you say, how could they not see it?
Exactly.
We've actually put people's names on. You know, something would be sort of, hi Dennis, spot this and win $1,000. And it could be massive on a big sheet of paper, and they simply won't see it.
Just don't get it. You're just blind to it.
You're just blind to these sorts of opportunities.
Oh!
It's a lesson in luck I have to work with.
I'm not only defeated, I'm humiliated!
So the purpose of that little trick that Richard played on Dennis there was to illustrate that you can talk to people as much as you like about general opportunities that are available to them, how they should pay attention to general opportunities. But actually, you need to be very specific. Richard actually points with his finger eventually to specific things if you're going to bring them truly to people's attention. Now, once you've identified opportunities for people, for instance, I used to go to companies. I used to go in, and within about 10 or 15 minutes at a company, I was advising them on how to cut their carbon emissions. And I could normally see within about 10 or 15 minutes of arriving at the company what they might do to cut their carbon emissions. Things that they had not paid attention to because they had their heads down producing whatever it was the company was producing, but they weren't necessarily looking at the lights that were lighting their warehouse or whatever, which might have been very wasteful. So it's important to draw people's attention to opportunities. How can people act so as to cut their carbon emissions if they don't know what the opportunities are? Again, you might say that's obvious, but it's surprising how often it goes by the board. The next thing in our acronym, Hot Topics, was the thoughts that people have when you present them with the opportunities. Now, when we talked about this, we went back to some ancient wisdom from someone called Epictetus, who lived about 2,000 years ago. Epictetus, slightly sexist language, said, "Men are not disturbed by things, but the view that they take of them." And this statement is in some ways the foundational credo, the foundational belief of the cognitive and behavioral therapies that some of you may have heard of. Some of you may have even had some CBT or some REBT, rational emotive behavioral therapy, or CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And what it says is that people, let us say someone who's depressed, are normally not depressed by the state of the world, but more depressed by the thoughts that they have about the state of the world, which is fundamentally an optimistic thing to say, because you often can't change the state of the world. Would that we could at the moment, but we can't change the state of the world. But we can, to some extent, not to all total extent, but to some extent, modify the thoughts that we have about the state of the world. And it is normally or often those thoughts that are the things that make us anxious or depressed or whatever, as opposed to the state of the world in itself, because the state of the world in itself is the same for everybody, but not everybody gets depressed. So when I used to go to hotels to discuss how they might change their behavior or change their activities, I used to point out that I used to go to hotels. So this is an example of the thoughts that they might have when I presented them with an opportunity. I used to point out that hotels would have corridors full of light bulbs which were on all the time, because they tend not to put windows in the corridors. They put the windows in the rooms of the paying guests for obvious reasons. So I would point out, even in those days, which is about 10 years ago now, that they could replace these halogen bulbs, these downlighters, the sort of thing you might have in your kitchen, with LED lights. Now, at that time, and not anymore, but those halogen bulbs cost about £2 a piece. And the LED spotlights with which I was suggesting that they would replace them cost about £23 as it was here. Now, they're much cheaper now, so the case would be even stronger for replacing them. But of course, for a hotel which might have 1,000 such bulbs, my asking them to replace each of those bulbs with something that was 10 times more expensive might have been seen to be, well, frankly, financially crazy. So often the first thought that people would have when I would present this opportunity to them would be, "You're crazy, this is ridiculously expensive, so please go away." I mean, essentially, they'd sort of show me the door. So I'd like to show you that that thought is what we might call a negative automatic thought. It's a thought that might spring to mind, but it is not a correct thought. And I'll just do that briefly by illustrating. For an 8-watt LED bulb, I was inviting them to replace maybe a 35-watt energy-saving bulb, or often they were 50-watt bulbs, that was on 20 hours a day. Often they were 24 hours a day, but let's say 20 hours a day. You can generate the overall cost of running that bulb, or buying and running those bulbs, and you get this graph here. This graph has got days along the x-axis, and 1200 days is something over 3.5 years. So you can see the red line, which is the cost of a halogen bulb, and the green line, which costs the LED bulb, but taking into account the purchase cost, which is at day one. So you can see £23 for the green line and about £2 for the red line, and then the running costs. Now the running costs are the cost of the energy used to light the bulb for 20 hours a day, and you can see that very quickly the halogen bulb, although it appears to be cheaper, and you can see every so many hours, every 2,000 hours or so, there's another £2 because the halogen bulb only lasts about 2,000 hours, whereas the LED bulb lasts about three or 4 years. So there's a little kink in the red line every time you have to buy a bulb, and I haven't counted any cost of someone changing that bulb. Often these hotels would have someone who did nothing but change bulbs. And you can see that after about 300 days, the supposedly cheap halogen bulb at £2 has cost you more than the supposedly expensive LED bulb. And over the life of the LED bulb, it costs about 3 times more, and not even counting the cost of someone changing the halogen bulbs. So what that means is that after 600 days, you've not only got your money back for the bulb, the extra money, your £21, but you've doubled that money. You're doubling money in 600 days is like putting it in a bank account that's paying 40% compounded interest. And the hotels that I was talking to at that time could borrow money from something called the Carbon Trust at 0 rate of interest for 3 years. So the real proposition that I was saying to them was, take some money at 0% rate of interest borrowing for 3 years and put it in an account that'll pay you 40% of interest tax-free, compounded over those 3 years. Now that, of course, means that it was financially brilliant thing to do. It was insane not to do it. And by this example, I just want to illustrate that the first thought is, that's far too expensive, you're crazy, out you go, can be wrong. And sometimes it's a matter of thinking in the right way about something. Otherwise, having the wrong thoughts might stop you doing something that is beneficial to you. And this is the extent to which I go back to the CBT, that the problems that people sometimes think of are in the thoughts, not in the real world. There are other thoughts that people sometimes have. Oh, there's nothing we can do in the UK because we're such a small country. Global warming can't be our responsibility. It must be some other country. Often people blame the Chinese or whatever. Just as another way of thinking about that, you might want to look at this paper, which was published in 2014, which tried to trace of the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere where most of it came from per head of population. And if you look at the right-hand column here, the warming responsibility per billion people in the population, we're top of that league in the United Kingdom, 0.5 degree of warming per billion of population. The reason being that we have been emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, whereas other countries in that list, notably China, which is way down the bottom at 1/10 of our contribution, has only been doing a lot of carbon emissions in the last 20 years or so, largely actually because we've exported our industry to places like that. So again, initial thoughts are sometimes deceptive and can stop you doing things when perhaps you ought. So I did a project taking into account some of my work that I'd done in engineering called the Cube Project. And in the Cube Project, I designed and we built some micro houses, some tiny houses, which we took to various exhibitions. Here's a picture of QB1, the first of the Cube buildings, as they were called, in the Cube Project. This is in St Andrew's Square outside Harvey Nichols in Edinburgh in the spring of 2011. And QB1 was the first such building. We also did a building called QB2. This was the second one, not a very original name, I know. And that one we had on George Clark's Amazing Spaces. There's a photo of me there with George Clark, and we had about 10 minutes on George Clark's Amazing Spaces on Channel 4, doing a tour of QB2, which was a small building, 3 by 4 meters, an internal plan, and 3 meters high inside, in which 2 people could live a comfortable and eco-friendly existence with a minimum carbon footprint. You can see videos of that on cubeproject.org.uk. I'm sorry for the sound of the siren that's passing by. These are the days that we live in. I did a lot of work on the Cube project, and you can go and have a look at the website there, cubeproject.org.uk, to see what opportunities we were trying to show to people. In the remainder of the talk, therefore, that was really just an introduction to some of the things I have done myself. I'll give you an overview of the research structure that we have in psychology, some of the research that we do and that our people do, a little overview tour. I'll give you a talk about the topics and the contacts that we have. I will tell you about the infrastructure, the labs and stuff that we have. I will tell you about some recent funding, and I'll tell you at the end about the commitment that we have to what are called Athena Swan principles, and those relate to equality and diversity, and I think it's very important to talk about those in everything we do with respect to universities, but particularly in respect to research and education. And then I'll give you some contact details at the end should you wish to ask me any more questions. So the research structure involves me. I'm the head of the Centre for Research in Psychology and Sports Sciences, and my colleague, Dr. Nick Troop, is the postgraduate tutor. He looks after people who are doing postgraduate degrees, masters by research, and non-taught postgraduate degrees, so masters by research and PhDs. And we also have what's called a DClin-Sci, it's the next line, Doctor of Clinical Psychology, a very well thought of Doctor of Clinical Psychology degree, which takes about 16 or 17 people in each of 3 years, led by Dr. Peter Nell, but the research tutor angle is covered by Dr. Helen Ellis-Caird and Dr. Lizette Nolte. We have psychology research seminar coordinators. We have a weekly research seminar with external speakers of great renown coming to talk to us, and that's organized by my colleague Professor Leah Kvavelashvili and Dr. Paul Jenkinson. And we have an early career researchers group run by my colleagues Dr. Bex Knight and Dr. Dan Gurney, themselves early career researchers. And we have specialist technical support in the department, John Gillard, Julia Mackenzie and John Bain, permanently housed in our department building. We also have university level support for computers and computer systems. So the first of our psychology research groups that I want to talk about is clinical and health psychology, one of the largest because it includes our staff in the doctorate of clinical psychology, I should say. Within that group, there are people with specialisms in a variety of subjects. One of them is chronic illness, and actually the specialist there, Dr. Helen Ellis-Caird, works closely with Dr. Nick Troop, looking at issues such as pain within long-term chronic illnesses like sickle cell anemia. We also have specialists in perinatal mental health, that is the mental health of babies and mothers at the time around birth. We have specialists in looked after children, and looked after children includes refugee children. We have specialisms in the clinical psychology of eating disorders, again shared across the department, not just within our DClin-Sci team, but Dr. Troop also has a good deal of expertise in that area. And we have what we call the Centre for Personal Construct Psychology. Personal construct psychology, pioneered by Kelly in the 1950s, George Kelly, was something of a specialism of the University of Hertfordshire, and we lodged the Fay Francella collection, Fay Francella being a famous researcher within that tradition who lodged her library of documents at the University of Hertfordshire, and where Emeritus Professor David Winter carried on that tradition of research. So the contacts for that group are Drs. Ellis, Caird and Troop, to whom I've referred. The next group that I want to talk about within the department is the Cognitive Neuropsychology group. A variety of our staff have specialisms within this area, some with the specialisms in the cognitive aspects of neuropsychological disorders. Neuropsychological disorders might include fairly common ones like Alzheimer's disease, schizophrenia or obsessive compulsive disorder, and my colleagues Professor Keith Laws, Dr. John Zone, Dr. Shazia Akhtar have their specialisms in those areas. We also have specialisms in the area of the perceptual psychology, perceptual effects in autism and other developmental disorders. Doctors Amanda Ludlow, Rob Gutierrez and Shivani Sharma work with people with autism, and Dr. Ludlow works with people with Tourette syndrome and other what we call neurodevelopmental disorders. And indeed, Dr. Ludlow is heading up a new research centre called the Panda Research Centre, which seeks to make contact with schools and other organisations to keep them up to date with research in that area. Dr. Paul Jenkinson does a lot of work on body consciousness in anosognosia. That sounds awfully posh, doesn't it? But that anosognosia is not knowing about something. In this case, the work that Paul Jenkinson does is people who have hemiplegia, so they are paralyzed in one side, but they don't know that they're paralyzed on one side. So their body consciousness is disrupted. Very, very interesting stuff. And Paul also does work on interoception, being able to perceive certain feelings internally, and interoceptive disorders. The final bit of work that Paul has done with at least a couple of PhD students is on the neuropsychology of pleasant touch, and I refer you to his research work if you want to know more about that very interesting subject. Bex Knight, another colleague, works on the neural mechanisms of spatial navigation and works closely with colleagues at UCL, in particular University College London. And we also have experts in statistical analysis of neuropsychological data, including Shazia Akhtar, Keith Sullivan and Diana Kornbrot, who is an emeritus professor. In the Learning, Memory and Thinking group, we have considerable expertise in prospective memory, that is the memory for things in the future, if that doesn't contradict itself. So remembering to do things in the future, prospective memory. We also have expertise in everyday and involuntary memory, things that come to mind even though you didn't intend them to, what my colleague Professor Leah Kivavilashvili calls mind pops, and then how these things are affected by aging in a memory and aging group. And that's Leah herself, and then Joanna Marcus Damu and Shazia Akhtar also work in that area with Leah. Dr. George Georgiou and myself and our colleague Dr. Ali Mayer, who's now at York University, work on wearable memory aids for people with memory disorders. We were researching whether people with memory disorders can be assisted by wearable cameras and things like that, making some recordings with which they can try and boost their memory later. I myself, as I mentioned, in respect to the work I've done with Alan Badley and Graham Hitch latterly, work on memory for serial order, excuse me, and word learning, and indeed serial order effects in developmental disorders, or often developmental disorders like dyslexia. George Georgiou, who I mentioned above, also does work on cognitive and clinical aspects of thought suppression. whether you can stop yourself smoking, for instance, by thinking about not smoking. George's work with James Erskine at St George's Hospital Medical School suggests that that's not a good thing to do. If you think about not smoking, you end up thinking, therefore, about smoking, and that causes you to smoke more sometimes. So there are counterintuitive things to be said about thought suppression and the benefits of it. And George also works on problem solving and incubation, whether, and if so, what are the processes that go on when you solve a problem by leaving it alone for a while, maybe going to sleep or thinking about something else. That's called incubation. We also have a prominent group who work on psychology of movement. Dr. Lucy Annette works on dance and Parkinson's with our erstwhile colleagues Dawn Rose, who's now in Switzerland, and Peter Lovett, Dr. Dance, who was for many years with the University of Hertfordshire. And that work also involves community outreach, and we run a Dance for Parkinson's group. And Lucy has extended that work recently into some studies of seated yoga or chair-based yoga for people in homes, older people in homes. Caroline Wyatt, who's relatively new in our department, studies micro movements in developmental populations, again, maybe people with autism, and how their micro movements might differ from people in normally developing populations. And we use very sensitive motion capture cameras for that work. And my colleague Dan Gurney looks at non-verbal communication, and in particular communication using gestures, sometimes in forensic settings. So Dan looks at work relating to how gestures in police interviews and things can influence the evidence that a witness might give, even though the gestures themselves, of course, unless you're videoing it, won't turn up on the tape. So that's very interesting work, and Dan consults with the Hertfordshire Constabulary, amongst others. We also have, we also have a big group involved in researching behaviour change in health and business. I mean, I talked a bit about behaviour change in relation to climate change at the start, and you can see that my Q project work comes at the end of this slide. But we've historically, through our previous head of department, Ben Fletcher, done quite a lot of work on behaviour change, and how behaviour change often involves changing what you do before changing what you think. I mean, often people think you change your behaviour by changing what you think, and then you automatically change what you do, but I indicated at the start of this talk that that's often not the case. Ben Fletcher, and through his company Do Something Different, has done a lot of work on this area. Richard Wiseman, our Professor of Public Understanding of Psychology, has also done a lot of public engagement in relation to his channels, his YouTube channels on quirkology and changing behavior in relation to healthy sleep patterns. But we now have an increasingly big body of research through the recruitment of a new professor and associate professor, Professor Catherine Brown and Associate Professor Katie Newby, to work with our other established experts, Nick Troop and Dr. Nick Troop and Dr. Neil Howlett, on health-related behaviour change, doing lots of work with organisations such as Active Hearts, trying to maybe look at how you can psychologically design interventions so that people are more active in their everyday lives, sedentary populations who would benefit from that activity. So that's a big focus of our research at the moment, and is very applied. And I mentioned my own work on pro-environmental behaviour change, which is less well advanced because I spend a lot of my time doing the memory work, but I think it will prove to be important that we behave differently with regard to the climate. Our head of department, Professor Joanna Adler, who's been with us for a year now, and her colleague Dr. Tim McSweeney, also do an increasing amount of work, including practical consultancy, in forensic matters. Forensic psychology relates to psychological issues, beg your pardon, around the criminal justice system, and they are working with organisations such as the Youth Endowment Fund and others on a lot of research relating to child safeguarding and other things. Also in our department, because we're Department of Psychology and Sports Sciences, we have expertise relating to sports psychology, such as our colleague Steve Pack, who looks at professional practice development, injury, performance enhancement, retirement and transition, mental health, exercise, all the things listed here. And we're hoping to offer in future a sports psychology module as one of your optional modules in your degree. Our research infrastructure, we have a good deal of research equipment, much of which has been purchased in the last 3 or 4 years. We've had a programme of replacement, as it says at the bottom of this slide. We've invested over £500,000 in our research facilities in the last 2 years alone. So that includes things like a 32-channel EEG, EEG scanner. This scans as an electroencephalograph. This is one of those skull cap full of sensors, if you like, that detects small electrical activity in the cortical surface of the brain. And we have that located in a purpose-built Faraday booth that keeps electrical interference out. So we have very sensitive measurements of brain activity in that relation across 32 different sensors. We have a very high-spec eye tracker, which can track the movement of the eyes every 1,000th of a second, so where people are looking. We have what's called BioPack, which makes physiological measurements of things like skin conductance and heart rate and other things. We have sophisticated movement sensors relating to BioPack, and also Kinect, which we used in our dance psychology research. We are investing this year in ever more sensitive and sophisticated motion capture cameras for some of the research to which I referred earlier by Caroline Wyatt and colleagues. And we've got a lot of classic psychological and psychometric tests, a battery of those which we can administer through licenses that we hold, in order to allow students and researchers to generate their own films and video materials. We have a full film and editing suite within the department, operated by my colleague John Bain, one of the technicians housed in the department to whom I referred earlier. And as I say, in recent developments, we've spent over £500,000 in developing those research facilities, and we are still updating our equipment on an ongoing basis. Our recent funding has been won from all sorts of sources, including the European Union Marie Curie Fellowship, Action Medical, so that's an example of some charitable funding, Southern Academic Coagulation Partnership and Royal London Hospital. That was work relating to pain management in people with blood disorders such as haemophilia. We have work we combine with our colleagues who work on kidney function and the interventions that you have to make in people's lives sometimes to deal with kidney disorders and the psychological consequences of those. And we've had a lot of grants through the British Renal Society on that. The Big Lottery Fund has funded our work, some of it on activity and behaviour change. The same with the Department of Health and the National Institute of Health Research, including a big study called READY, which we're doing with our colleagues in Health and Social Work faculty, or Health and Social Work School as it should be called. And that's a £2.5 million project, in fact, that is just starting up in the months in which I'm doing this recording. We get QR funding. QR funding comes from something called the Research Excellence Framework. In 2014, it's the last Research Excellence Framework that was conducted, and we're currently in the middle of doing one at the moment, REF 2021. But in 2014, over half of our research was rated internationally excellent or world leading at the University of Hertfordshire, and we were very proud of that record. And finally, I said I'd come to the Athena Swan principles. The Athena Swan principles started with reference to the promotion of equality and diversity, originally with respect to women in science and in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But now and medicine, they added another M. But now these principles we're applying much more widely in our equality, diversity initiatives. And I just wanted to finish this talk really with an illustration of those principles, which you can read here on this slide. But just to emphasize our commitment to equality issues within research, not just in relation to equality between the sexes, genders, but also to racial equality, issues relating to LGBT, all equality issues that we are aware of are ones that we take very seriously in the research agenda. And I wanted to finish really by saying that we welcome anybody who wishes to do research and wishes to join with us in doing research, regardless of any equality issues which they may feel might have held them back in the past. So that's just a commitment from us to you that when you join the University of Hertfordshire, we are alive to those issues and we are actively pursuing them. And my colleagues in psychology are amongst the people who've shown the greatest commitment to putting the Athena Swan principles into action and to extending them wherever we can. So thank you. That was a little, a brief tour of the research that we do in the Department of Psychology, within the Department of Psychology and Sports Sciences, in the section of psychology, I should call it, or the psychology group within our larger department. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening to this under odd circumstances in which we find ourselves, but I hope that some of that was helpful. If you want to contact me with for further information about the research that we do, then these are my contact details, my page at m.2.page@hearts.ac.uk, and there's my phone number, and I would be happy to talk to you further about the research that we do. I wish you all very well in these difficult times, and I look forward to seeing you in person in due course. Thank you very much.